It's 31,000 years ago. You're lying on the floor of a cave in Borneo. Someone is kneeling over your leg with a sharpened stone, and they're about to cut it off. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, no hospital, no idea that germs even exist. By everything you think you know about the ancient world, this is the part where you quietly die of infection a week later, except you don't. You live for years afterward, the better part of a decade. This is the story of how ancient humans did surgery, real surgery, cutting off limbs, drilling holes into skulls, stitching wounds meant shut tens of thousands of years before medicine existed, before anyone wrote a single word. And the strangest part isn't that they tried it, it's that it worked. Let's start with that cave in Borneo, because it genuinely rewrote the history books. In 2020, archaeologists were digging in a place called Liang Tebo, a remote limestone cave so cut off you can only reach it by boat at certain times of year. The walls are covered in some of the oldest rock art on Earth, and buried in the floor they found a skeleton. It was mostly complete, except for one thing. The lower left leg, from about the shin down, was gone. Now, the obvious assumption is the boring one. An animal got it. An accident, some ancient tragedy. But when they looked closely at the bone, the story fell apart because the bone hadn't been torn or crushed. It had been cleanly cut, and then, this is the part that matters, it had healed. The end of the bone was smooth and remodeled, the way bone only gets when a body keeps living and rebuilding for years. Whoever this person was, they had their leg amputated as a child, and they survived for another 6 to 9 years. Take a second with that. This is a Stone Age kid, 31,000 years ago, getting a surgical amputation and pulling through. The previous record for the oldest known surgery was a 7,000-year-old skeleton in France. This blew past it by 24,000 years. Suddenly, the timeline of human medicine wasn't a few thousand years old. It was deep, deep into the Ice Age. But here's the thing, nobody tells you. The cut isn't even the impressive part. Think about everything that has to go right for that child to live. First, the surgeon has to get through the leg without the patient bleeding to death, which means understanding where the blood vessels are and how to stop them. Second, they have to do it without the kid dying of shock or pain, which means some form of painkiller. Third, and this is the killer, they have to keep that wound from getting infected. And remember where this is, a tropical rainforest, one of the easiest places on the planet for an open wound to turn septic. One of the scientists on the dig pointed out that she once cut her finger on the excavation and had to rush to a hospital for antibiotics, and she had antibiotics. This child had none. So the only way this works, the only way, is if these people already knew which plants stop bleeding, which ones numb pain, and which ones fight infection. 31,000 years ago, somebody had a pharmacy. It just grew in the forest, and it lived in their heads. Okay, so they could amputate. You're probably thinking, fine, that's one incredibly lucky case. Surely the rest was guesswork. It wasn't. Let's talk about the skull. There's a practice called trepanning, and it is exactly as alarming as it sounds. You take a sharp tool, you press it against a living person's head, and you drill, scrape, or cut a hole straight through the bone while they're awake. People did this all over the ancient world. We found trepanned skulls more than 9,000 years old, from a cemetery in Ukraine to ancient Greece to the Inca in South America. Different continents, different centuries, same hole in the head. And no, this wasn't a one-way trip. Here's how we know. The bone around the holes grew back. The edges are smooth and rounded, which only happens if the patient is alive and healing afterward. In some skulls you can see 2, 3, even more holes, all healed at different times, meaning the same person went under the tool more than once and lived every time. Why would anyone do this? We're honestly not totally sure. Maybe to relieve pressure after a head injury, maybe to treat headaches, seizures, or things they blamed on spirits. But the why matters less than the what. The what is that ancient humans were performing skull surgery with a survival rate that, for a hole in your head made with a rock, is frankly insulting to how impressive it is. Now, stitches, because cutting people open is one problem, closing them back up is another. Long before metal needles, humans were sewing wounds shut. We found bone needles thousands of years old, threaded with plant fiber, tendon, even hair. But my favorite method, And I cannot stress enough that this is real, used living ants. Here's how it works. You hold the edges of the wound together. Then you take a large ant with big, strong jaws, army ants, driver ants, and you bring it up to the cut. The ant does what ants do. It clamps down, biting across the wound and pulling the two sides together, and then you calmly twist off its body. The head stays behind. The jaws stay locked. You've just installed a tiny living staple. Repeat down the length of the wound, and you've stitched a person shut with a row of ant heads. This wasn't some desperate one-off. It shows up in ancient Indian texts going back around 3,000 years, refined by surgeons like Sushruta, and it was used independently by peoples in South America too. It works so well that the mandibles even have mild antimicrobial properties. Different humans on different continents all looked at an ant and thought, medical equipment. And it goes deeper than emergencies. These people understood prevention and pain. Meet Ötzi. He's a 5,000-year-old man whose frozen body melted out of a glacier in the Alps, preserved almost perfectly. And Ötzi is covered in tattoos, 61 of them, but they're not decoration. They're little lines and crosses, clustered on his lower back, his knees, his ankles. Exactly the joints where, given his age, he'd have had pain and arthritis. Researchers think these tattoos were a treatment, rubbed into the skin right where it hurt. The oldest known pain management, written on a human body. And in his gear, he was carrying a specific fungus, birch polypore, that we now know has antibacterial and antiparasitic properties. He wasn't carrying it for a snack. He was carrying medicine. So step back and look at what we've got. They could amputate. They could open a skull and you'd live. They could stitch you up, numb your pain, and fight your infections. Tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote down a word of it. But here's the part that actually gets me. The most advanced piece of ancient medicine wasn't a tool or a plant or a technique. It was other people. Go back to that child in Borneo. After the surgery, a one-legged kid in an ice age rainforest cannot survive alone. Somebody had to carry them. Somebody had to feed them, clean the wound, keep them warm, protect them, not for a week, but for years. That amputation only shows up in the bones because an entire group decided this child was worth keeping alive, even when they couldn't hunt, couldn't keep up, couldn't contribute the way everyone else did. We see it again and again. A Neanderthal skeleton from a cave called Shanidar belonged to a man who was badly injured, likely blind in one eye with a withered arm, and he lived for years that way, which means his people fed and protected him too. This is the thing the cartoon version of Prehistory gets completely wrong. We picture cavemen as brutes, every man for himself, the weak left behind. The actual evidence says the opposite. The defining feature of ancient human medicine isn't the sharpened stone or the clever ant. It's a community that refused to let you die just because you'd become hard to save. So, back to the floor of that cave, the stone against your skin. No anesthetic, no antibiotics, no idea germs exist. By everything you assumed, you should be dead. But the hands working on you aren't fumbling. They know where the blood flows. They know the plant that dulls the pain and the one that stops the rot. And when it's over, they don't leave you. They carry you out and they keep you alive long enough for the bone to heal smooth. The technology changed. The knowledge that almost died with every generation eventually got written down, refined, multiplied into the medicine you have today. But the instinct to look at a suffering person and decide to do something, anything to save them, that part is old. Older than writing, older than farming, older than history itself. They were already surgeons. They were already healers. And the strangest part isn't that they tried. It's that, against everything, it worked.